Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week in our time travel series, we're looking at two films that use time travel to save or rescue someone. And the two films that we're looking at to explore that theme are Frequency from 2000, directed by Gregory Hoblit, and the Netflix original movie See You Yesterday from 2019, directed by Stefan Bristol. I'd only seen one of these films previously. Obviously, See You Yesterday is a relatively new film at the time of recording, and I wasn't even aware of it. Had you seen either or both of these, James?
No, I must have seen Frequency before because I remembered it. Like, it was one of those ones where you watched it a while ago and you've got like a vague recollection about what happens in it. It was one of those ones for me. But yeah, it was an interesting experience going back to that, and seeing See You Yesterday was a whole new experience as well, having sort of like never watched that before. And it was on Netflix as well, so it was nice and easy to access.
Yeah, and it's nice and short. Anyway, Frequency from 2000. Should we get started with that one? I've got the same experience as you. I remembered it, but it was good to relive it. Let's chat about it.
Once in a decade, massive solar storms invade our atmosphere, disrupting global communications.
Darren, it's your dad's old ham radio. Let's go over to the den, huh? Plug it in.
And causing unexplained phenomenon.
W2QYD. This is Frank Sullivan.
Hello? What'd you say your name was?
Frank Sullivan.
Is this some kind of joke?
That will allow John Sullivan to talk to his father.
What do you say we tame this Bronco, huh? You and me, spirit and guts.
Who's been dead for 30 years.
So Frequency from 2000. When you say you remember it, what bits do you remember about Frequency?
I remember the feel of the movie, and I remembered enjoying it, and I remembered finding it quite a moving film, and I remembered the basic plot of it, but I have to say I forgot big chunks of the plot and what happens kind of halfway through the movie where it takes a big shift. I'd completely forgotten that. So it was good to relive. I mean, I probably saw it about 20 years ago, I guess, and that is quite a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten the whole second half of the film. I did not expect it to happen, but we'll get into that. We'll talk about that as we go. So first off, let's talk a little bit about how they set the scene in the film. So it's quite a sort of a nostalgic look back into the past, isn't it? So it goes back into, what year is it, 1968?
It's 69 and 99. There's a classic 30-year generational age gap in a time travel movie using the Back to the Future model.
Yeah, we love a 30-year look back. And they show us sort of the life of this guy called Frank, who is played by Dennis Quaid. And he's a fireman. He's very heroic. So the premise of the film, we should talk about that first. So the premise is this guy's dad has died and he suddenly is able to talk to him via a radio. So he's sort of like communicating with him from the past. No, he's communicating with him from the future to the past. And he's sort of like talking to him and trying to sort of save his life, basically. And that's the main premise. And in the intro with this film, I thought Dennis Quaid was going to die within the first 5 minutes. That's what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah, I thought so too. It starts with, I think they do that deliberately because of an awareness of the way these films are always marketed, people would have been going in knowing that it's about, or expecting it to be about saving Dennis Quaid. So yeah, they set it up with a big set piece. He's a firefighter and there's a huge explosion and it's going horribly wrong and he just gets out alive. And yeah, I was the same as you. I was expecting him to die straight away, and I was expecting much more of the movie to be about the radio and the communication to prevent that event from happening, with the kind of climax of the movie going to be saving him from that explosion. That's not at all what happens, and it shifts about in a completely different way to that.
It does, definitely. But this sort of like the intro bit is all about this sort of story about him trying to save his dad, isn't it? So when we see 1968, 1969, when we see that time period, it is a nostalgic look back, isn't it? It's very much like this was his idyllic childhood. His dad's like a really heroic firefighter. His mum is this sort of like great looking woman who's making food in the kitchen, sort of like the like traditional kind of stereotype. And like he's this happy kid, isn't he? Who's sort of like just playing baseball and playing catch with his dad. They juxtapose that with Jim Caviezel's sort of future where it's quite sort of depressing, isn't it? It's like he's in a failed relationship. He lives in this big old house on his own. It's quite dark and a bit run down from the looks of it.
It's dark and rainy. He's living in his childhood home as well, which is important for the plot and the time travel. That's a necessary feature of it, but it kind of creates this character that's like living inside these bad memories and just exists in this sad life, really. His mum doesn't live there with him, does she? She's moved out into some apartment, but he's chosen to live in the house with all the memories and all the sadness.
Yeah, but you kind of see in this film, which we've seen a few times, the sort of the romanticizing of the past, and it's done very deliberately in this because you want it to look so much better than his current present, because that's important for the film, because he wants to change things, and in order for the time travel to work, you have to make it look like he's got a really depressing life in his present. So if he's able to change this this thing which majorly impacted his life, is that going to change his sort of trajectory? Yeah,
and a lot of that nostalgia is created through, it's hung on the hook of baseball, isn't it? They, like you said earlier, when he's a happy young kid, he's tossing the ball with his dad. I think they might watch some baseball together as well in 1969. And then later on, when the radio starts to connect them through time, it's chatting about the 1969 Baseball World Series that they really bond over. They bond over that before they realise that there's any time travel going on and that they're related. They're just chatting about baseball because they both love baseball.
That's it. It's proper sort of like, what do they say? Like apple pie. It's like American apple pie nostalgia kind of stuff they're going for in this film. So you mentioned the sort of the moment when they do sort of have that time travel experience. How does the time travel work in this film then? We should probably go through that.
Well, I think we should say that it's stretching the limits of science fiction again. We looked at Groundhog Day, that is fundamentally not a science fiction film, but it deals with time travel. I think Frequency does tend to get lumped in as a sci-fi movie, but the sci-fi elements of it are that the Aurora Borealis is happening 30 years apart. It happens in 69 and 99. And I guess beyond that, all you can really say is the Aurora Borealis is magic and it creates a time-traveling radio, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it, isn't it? They do sort of like try and throw in a really small sliver of science, though, don't they? There's that bit when there's something on the news or something like that, and they're talking about string theory.
They have a clip of Brian Greene, who's a theoretical physicist. He wrote The Elegant Universe, which is a book that I used to own and didn't read.
One of
much
those.
In the same way, much in the same way that people who have a copy of like The Brief History of Time sitting on a coffee table and never read it. I was one of them with Brian Greene, but he's one of those types of scientists, and they show him being interviewed. And what's he saying? He's talking about the Aurora Borealis it's a mysterious thing, but then he just changes the subject anyway to talk about string theory. So I'm not even sure if he's supposed to be trying to sell people on Aurora Borealis within the movie.
Yeah, it was just kind of one of those moments in films where they try and give you some science knowledge in a very brief summary, and then that kind of explains it all, even though it doesn't tell you anything at all.
Yeah, it doesn't matter though, does it? I'm happy to say up front, talking about this film, I really, really liked it, and I think it works really, really well. And the looseness of the science fiction doesn't hamper the really moving, really well told narrative of it. And that narrative hinges on time travel, which is what makes it a relevant movie for us this series. So we've got this radio that's linking 1969 and 1999 using Aurora Borealis at this time of the year in this part of the country, localized entirely in your ham radio. Who or what is traveling through time in this film?
So it's all sound, isn't it? Because it's just the guy's voice traveling back in time to talk to his dad.
But yeah, specifically it's sound, and I guess conceptually it's information, isn't it? We talked about causal loops when we looked at predestination a few episodes ago, and causal loops can be a person going back in time and affecting their own timeline, or it can be an object, or it can be just information, because that information can have an impact on prior events, which is what happens in frequency, right? The information that John gives Frank enables him to get out of the burning building quickly enough or at the right time. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but he doesn't die is the important thing.
Yeah, and this was the kind of idea which I thought they were going to have in A Connecticut Yankee when we looked back at that. Because in that film, which is which predates this film by a lot, the scientist is proposing that he can listen back to the past. He can listen to sounds from the past. He can visit medieval times by listening by the sound waves or something like that. So this is kind of like that idea, with extra stuff put on, because if you visit a time via sound waves, or if you can tap into a time via sound waves and they have a radio as well, then you can get this back and forth communication. So I really like that idea in the film. And I think it's a very sort of interesting premise for time travel, just being able to communicate via a radio back in time.
Yes, we've got this two-way radio that's sending information through time, which enables Johnny to talk to Frank and make changes in the past. How does he first realize that possibility?
So the first proper moment when he sort of figures out that being able to chat to his dad in the past can affect his future is when there's the moment with the cigarette and the table, and so he's chatting to his dad about baseball. At this point, he's just sort of realized that it is his dad, and his dad burns the table, and then suddenly he sees that burn in his presence. So Johnny is seeing that where he is, not having ever seen that before. So it appears in front of him. So it's just like Time Cop, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Time Cop rules for real-time impact on time travelers or people affected by time travel events.
That's it. See, another great feature of Time Cop, it's given us this rule. The Time Cop rule is when something happens in the past and it affects the future and it hasn't happened before, then yeah, that's the Time Cop rule. So the scar in Time Cop, when McComb gets cut, his future self suddenly has a scar. Bits like that.
Yeah, and I had a slight problem with that in Time Cop and in other movies that do that, because the real-time impact of it didn't quite sit with me. It sort of only works because it's a film and you have to kind of show it with some cinematic language. But I actually quite liked it in Frequency, because it's a unique concept in Frequency that we've got this ham radio that is creating a real-time link. And as long as the ham radio has its magical Aurora Borealis powers, there's this real-time connection between the two time periods. So that helped me accept this real-time stuff happening to the desk, and then that allows more changes to happen. And it's also what gives John that inspiration that he can save Frank, because if the desk can pop up with a burn, then things are now subject to change now that he's discovered the power of the radio, and it gives him the motivation to do more, to push Frank to get out of that fire alive. Yeah, because that is the pivotal moment, isn't it, in this film, really, when John has given Frank the information that saves his life. So he says, what happened is you went wrong, you went one way because you were following your instincts, but because you did that, you ended up running into the fire. So he goes the other way, he gets out, he saves the woman, and then you've got this scene where Johnny's suddenly sort of reliving all of these years, but with his dad.
So what did you think about this bit? Because we talked about alternate realities before, and sort of when you change something in the past and you go back to what was your present, then you haven't got like any memory of this alternate reality. Whereas in this one, this is the first time we've seen a character who's suddenly reliving all of those years, but he still has the memories of the old timeline. So what did you think about that?
Yeah, that was quite a cool new concept for us as we've been looking at time travel films. And I thought it was really helpful to just watch some alternate reality time travel movies as well, and then see the juxtaposition in frequency. So they show it as like Johnny gets like an instant rush of new memories straight away from saving his dad. And tragically, those new memories include that his mother died shortly after his dad should have died. And Jim Caviezel's quite good in this scene and throughout the movie at selling that idea. He's someone who's constantly got to deal with his own memories changing in real time, and he's really struggling with that, and it looks quite stressful certainly when it happens for the first time, because he thinks it's just like a horrible nightmare, and he's got to reconcile this new understanding of the world with existing memories of a different world that existed just one day before.
Yeah, because that as a concept it's a lot to take in. If you're someone who's remembering something but you remember it two different ways, how can you differentiate between those two? Because some of them might be identical as well. Some of them may have played out almost in exactly the same way, but there's certain moments in his life which have completely branched off because his dad's there now. So yeah, he does that really well, and you can see sort of like in his performance that he's sort of like struggling with this sort of like dual history that he's dealing with.
Yeah, and the best moments of that for his performance as an actor in the film are when John, at the very beginning when he's talking to Frank, he's someone who's lost his father, and he's got this opportunity to just talk to his father and bond with his father over baseball again, and that's really moving. And then I think it's a real treat for Jim Caviezel as an actor to get to do this. He then gets to do it again and have another tragic moment where he speaks to his mum, who he's now lost because of the changes to the timeline. And he has another one of these very moving conversations where his mum comes to the radio in 1969 and he talks to her briefly. It's great. And like I said before, Jim Caviezel just really sells the whole thing. And I think he's very lucky as an actor to get to do that sort of thing twice in a different way, and it's really interesting and very moving, I thought.
Hi.
Hi, John. Frank tells me you're a cop?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah? Well, my 6-year-old keeps telling us he wants to be a policeman right after he retires from the majors. We just bought him a badge and a whistle for his birthday.
Yeah, I remember. I used to play cops and robbers all the time, but my mom wouldn't let me have a toy gun.
Sounds like your mom and I would get along.
Yeah, she's pretty special. I'm real proud of her.
Well, I bet she's proud of you too, huh? Being a cop and all?
I hope so. I hope she knows how much I love her.
Oh, she knows. Moms always know how much their kids love them. Even if they don't tell them all the time, like they should.
Yeah, so you mentioned that he's now lost his mum. This is when the film sort of like takes a bit of a change of pace, change of storyline. Before that, and what I thought the whole film was going to be was just him trying to save his dad. I thought it was going to be him trying to think of different ways in order to make sure that his dad's alive in his present. But it doesn't turn out to be that, does it? It turns out because he's done that small change, his dad being there at that time means that his mum comes into direct contact with this guy called the Nightingale Killer. So this later results in the Nightingale Killer killing his mum, and that has thrown things all out of whack. So it suddenly becomes a murder mystery, doesn't it?
Yeah, that really took me by surprise. And you mentioned before that it threw you off. But I really liked it. It's not just a murder mystery. It's like a time travel buddy cop movie because they've got to work together to now solve the Nightingale murder mystery using John's got foreknowledge of it because he's a homicide cop in 99. So he's got all the case files, and they've got access to the Nightingale murderer before the crimes have happened in 1969 through Frank. It's a very original concept. It's tied together with all the emotional stuff. It's great, and it turns into a real thriller from the midway point onwards.
Yeah, it's a really weird change. I think I lost my way with it a little bit when it sort of changed, but I think it's just because I wasn't expecting it. And because in my memory, I always remember this as being sort of like a really sort of nostalgic son and father film. And then it suddenly became, like you said, like a buddy cop film. So it's still got that kind of aspect, but it wasn't the sort of like romanticized version I had in my head. Because I was focused on all the nostalgia bits and all that kind of stuff.
The thing is, though, what I did clock at the very beginning, the Nightingale murderer is mentioned. You can hear it on a radio, like in the opening credits, that there are these murders going on. Which I was the same as you. As far as I could remember, it was just the Save Your Dad stuff. But I did clock that at the very beginning. I was like, why is there a murderer being mentioned on the radio, a fictional serial killer mentioned on the radio? What's that got to do with anything? And then they sort of warm up to it because she's a nurse and he's in the hospital before they've figured out that there's a serial killer. And I think we also see John as a cop investigating murders, but it's not really dwelt on for a long time in the future. It's just that he deals with serial killer cold cases, and that's his job. And then they just stitch those bits up together in the middle, and it all becomes one thing. And I just found it quite satisfying. Yeah,
because initially it looks like that's just part of making John's life look a bit more dark and depressing, because his job is to deal with murders. He's sort of like finding dead bodies, and this dead body is from a case he can't solve because it's like years old. He's got no leads on it. But then, you're right. It does sort of like have lots of little signifiers at the start of the film that this Nightingale murder case is going to become significant. And it does. And the whole buddy cop thing is really fun. But it comes down to this whole sort of, in the end, Frank has to try and explain why he's doing all of these weird things and why he's behaving in such like a crazy way. Because he's going around to go to clubs and look at and sort of like chase after women is what it's looking like. But really, he's a good guy. He's just trying to make sure they're okay. But to anybody else, he just looks like a big old creep, doesn't he?
Yeah, and worst of all, he places himself at the scene of one of the crimes, and he's too late to prevent it, which means he's witnessed going into the flat of a woman who's just been murdered. So it's not a good look for Frank, and understandably, he gets arrested by his best mate, who is also a homicide cop. And he's got to. We've talked before, haven't we, about the problems that time travelers face, which is people will question you about it, and they want proof, and they want to be convinced, and it's very, very hard to do that. So he's there with his best mate, who has all the best will in the world and wants to believe him, but he just can't believe this insane story that his grown-up son's talking to him through a ham radio, which, fair enough, right? It's a hard sell.
And even his wife sort of says like, oh yeah, we've been talking to this guy, Johnny, on the radio. So she sort of like corroborates his story and backs him up on that.
Kind of, but it just makes him look crazier, because it makes him look delusional, because she's saying they are talking to a real 30, 40-year-old man called Johnny, and that just makes it look like he's cooked up this story about his little son Johnny, who's travelled into the future somehow, and she's telling the it seems like she'd be telling the real side of the story, which is just talking to a guy on the radio. That's normal. It's 1969. We love a ham radio.
Yeah, it does sort of like add fuel to the fire, but it's kind of like you're getting little bits, and it's frustrating to watch, because you know it's real, it's all happening, but it's all these little bits that sort of like that aren't easily explained away. But it's like he's doing his best, and there's the moment where he says, right, in this baseball game, this is going to happen, and this becomes sort of like the moment which can prove that he has this knowledge from the future, that his story could be real. But even with that, his friend goes to a bar and he's talking to Frank's wife, and it's in the background, so he's not fully paying attention, and you know he's going to pay attention at some point. But it's just so frustrating. And then, to make matters worse, the Nightingale killer is in the police station. He's a cop. Oh my God. It's just like... And then Frank's having to try and sort of like jerry-rig this, like, what is it? He's trying to electrocute him or something. The Nightingale killer. And he's doing all of this weird stuff, like Home Aloneing it in this interrogation room. And he's doing all of that. And it's kind of like...
James, can you hear yourself? You're saying that you don't like it when it changes into this cop thriller. Listen to yourself. You are excited just talking about the plot. It's great. It's really fun.
Actually, looking back at it, like, the more I think about it, it does have some really good moments. I think it was just sort of like when he was just going around the clubs looking at women, not really solving the case or anything, and then intercutting between like him having fun talking to his son on the radio. I think that bit kind of meandered for me. But this interrogation room scene, that's a whole different story.
That was amazing. And it was nice that the baseball nostalgia from the first half of the movie comes back into the murder mystery cop thriller to save the day, and it's what convinces his friend that he really has got knowledge of the future, because he's had these long nostalgic conversations with his son and he knows what happens in the second, third, fourth game of the series.
Okay, you've got me there. That's a good plot point. They've done well there.
Hey, how the hell did you do it? Do what? Do what? The series. You called Buford's Homer. How the hell did you do it?
Wasn't too tough, buddy. The game happened 30 years ago.
Yeah, right, yeah. 30 years ago, yeah, sure. So I suppose you can tell me what happened in game 2, huh?
Yeah, sure. Top of the ninth, Al Weiss, game-winning RBI single. Brooks Robinson grounds out to end the game.
Daddy, come up and sing the baseball song.
Hey, little chief. You all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, you just go on up. I'll be there in a minute, all right?
Okay.
All right.
So at this point in the film, that's when Frank's under arrest. And when he was arrested, there was a bit of a scuffle and the radio broke, which kind of disrupts my theory that we've got this consistent radio that allows this real-time time travel communication stuff. But whatever, I was really enjoying the film, so I won't get hung up on it. But we have to get the radio repaired, don't we? Otherwise, we can't resolve the movie.
But at the same, I see what you mean though. At the same time, it's kind of like it isn't happening in real time, is it? There's like a delay between what's happening in the past and how the future is, because you're having to wait for the events to unfold in the past for them to have the impact on the future. So you're seeing like two different timelines at different paces, because if it was sort of like instantaneous, Johnny's given this information to his dad, the radio's broken, and then at that point, it should all be sort of like the end, the finale. But there's like a bit of lead up to it, isn't there still?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Because I feel like the radio is acting as creating a window through time, and the breaking of the radio should close the window. But it doesn't. But I guess I'll tell you why it doesn't. It's because the Aurora Borealis is still happening, right? Because that's still up in the sky. Yeah, and at the end of the movie, the Aurora Borealis kind of like fades away. Like, my work here is done. I return to the sun.
It's like Mary Poppins, isn't it? It's like finished and it's off.
So I think that's why our window through time stays open, because of the effects of the Aurora Borealis. So I think we've got to let them off there. How do they get that sorted then? Because that we got a broken radio. There's no way to communicate through time anymore.
So Frank has solved the case in the past. He's sort of like, he's defeated the killer, so we think everything's fine at that point. And then he goes back to try and fix the radio. When he does that, the radio sort of magically fixes itself in the future, in Johnny's present. And it's like a weird little sequence, isn't it? Because it just sort of like comes back to life. It's sort of repairing itself instantaneously, but it's not really, because we're just seeing it move in that time, so it's where it should be anyway in that timeline now that it's been changed.
Yeah, and all through this, Johnny's retaining multiple sets of memories, so he's able to continue to be the John and the hero in the future, in the present day, in 99. He doesn't get his memories reset because no one else in the film, apart from John, has conflicting memories. Everyone else is just, reality just melds around John, and he's got this immunity that we talked about before, where he's aware of time travel and he's aware that changes are happening, which means that he's the only one that gets multiple memories. I think that's right.
Yeah,
was that your take on it?
There's no one else who has that, because his dad is just living his life for the first time, just with extra life, because his trajectory's been changed because of that information he had. So it's only Johnny who has that sort of like dual memory.
I think so, except let's talk about the final sequence of the film, because I think that kind of complicates that idea a little bit, because I think someone else intrudes on this time travel window and might experience things a little bit in the same way that John does, but it's not fully explained, right? So the radio's repaired and they're talking again, and we think that Jack Shepherd, that's the name of the bad guy, isn't it? We think Jack Shepherd, the cop who did the Nightingale murders, is dead.
Jack Shepherd's also the guy out of Lost, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
That's why I was really confused when he said Jack Shepherd.
And Elizabeth Mitchell, the mum in this, is Juliet from Lost.
Yeah, all the Lost connections.
Yeah. Anyway, as that's all happening, Shepherd shows up and ambushes John in 1999 as he's on the radio, and at the same time in 1969 ambushes Frank. So we have this like double showdown. I loved it. It was really exciting.
This bit I really enjoyed. I thought it was a really clever idea, like cutting between those two fights happening in different moments in time, but they're so connected.
Yeah. And the way that I don't think Shepherd knows what the radio does, but he puts the time travel advantage out of action. He handcuffs Frank in 1969, so he can't use any foreknowledge to get the upper hand, and he basically just beats up John. He doesn't. There's no time travel upper hand for John because he's in the present day. But yeah, he's putting that ability of the radio out of commission so that he can do his evil stuff.
I thought that was a simpler thing. I thought it was just because he wanted Frank out of commission so that he can like go and assault his wife upstairs.
Yeah. Oh no, I think so. That's what I'm saying. I don't think that Shepherd is aware of of what the radio's doing, but it has the impact of putting their special time travel ability out of commission.
So Frank manages to get out of the handcuffs there, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And then when he does, he starts like does he go on the radio? I can't remember. Something happens with the radio. So he's contacting Johnny.
He tries to, but Johnny's already in a fight with Shepherd in 1999. So he can't get in touch with Frank again. Frank's got to save his family. And this is where the including another character into the time travel bubble kind of comes into things. And I think even two characters, because, well, Frank saves the day. He's got a shotgun because it's America in 1969. And he shoots Shepherd in the hand. Does he, I think?
Yeah, and it just like explodes.
Yeah, gross. And then in real time, Shepherd in 99 watches in horror as his hand like dissolves in front of his eyes, where he was pinning a gun against John's head. Now, the question I have here is, what does Shepherd in 1999 think is happening to his hand? Because we've seen other characters who just go about their daily business. Their memories have been changed. They've got no confusion. But is Shepherd separated from that because he sees his hand dissolve?
Well, he sees his hand dissolve, but he also hears something on the radio, doesn't he? He hears somebody talking. So he's having that direct contact.
Does he? Oh.
Yeah. So I think that might be, because I think you're right. I think he does sort of like have that memory flood as well. But it's so brief you don't see it.
Yeah, and he's not a main character. He's the bad guy. So we're not, the audience isn't like invited into that perspective of him the same way we see John having nightmare-like experiences of new memories. We don't quite get that with Shepherd. He's a bad guy, so we don't experience that. But I think you're right. I don't think I noticed that he heard something on the radio. So there's something there about including him in the time travel because he heard the radio. He might not have time to fully digest it and understand it, but let's call them magical powers of the radio then envelop him in that bubble. So he goes through this horrible experience of seeing his hand dissolve and dealing with those memories colliding.
Yeah, I mean, he did deserve it. He's a horrible, horrible guy.
Of course. I'm not debating that.
Just saying, it's bad. Like, he's having a bad time though, either way.
Yeah, exactly. But then super happy ending. Not only does he see his hand dissolve in front of him, but we now have a timeline where Frank is alive, Julia's alive, presumably. Frank's alive, Julia's alive, John's now not going to be shot in the head because Shepard's hand dissolves, and Frank's there with his shotgun again, presumably the same shotgun 30 years later, looked after, and he blows him away.
And then you've got old man Dennis Quaid coming through, and it's just like such a great moment because you've been wanting these two to like have a chat and be in the same room throughout the whole thing, and then suddenly they're there at the same time. And yeah, it's just really satisfying, isn't it?
It is really satisfying, and it goes back to what we thought was the original concept of the film, which was we both thought it was going to be more about saving his father so he could see his father again. And it does actually get back around to that. We have this whole middle plot of saving his mum, but the resolution of all of that is that they get to meet face to face and he gets to see his dad again, which was the whole point of the film. And it's really moving and really satisfying. I loved it.
And it ends with like him having a baseball game with his dad, and he's got a kid now. This seems to happen every time. Like, if you change the past, you end up with a kid that you may or may not remember.
But it works in Frequency because Frequency has established that it doesn't create divergent timelines. It's one timeline that just gets mashed together in John's head. So we can now reliably assume that John has all the happy memories of raising his son, and he knows his son, unlike, for example, Time Cop, where Jean-Claude Van Damme shows back up and has a 10-year-old son that he has absolutely no knowledge of and has to act normal around. We know that it's a much happier ending than that in Frequency because John's going to have his memories all squished together.
There's a ship on the ocean.
So it's a lovely happy ending for Frank and John. They're reunited. There's baseball. There's a son, grandson. It's all very happy. But it wasn't without complications. And our next film that we're talking about today has a lot of complications as well. And it really gets into those complications and that drives the narrative. So I say, let's move on to See You Yesterday.
Let's do it.
When we get this up and running, we're going to be out of here. Stanford, Morehouse, Spelman.
Hey, ring the alarm. Hey, whoa.
This is something Einstein spent his entire life trying to do.
We proved that time travel into the past is possible. If we just give it some time.
It's scary, but you inspire me. You going places, CJ, and since Pops is gone, I gotta make sure that you get there.
I don't need you always playing Big Brother.
I'm the only big brother you've got. NYPD, don't move!
Calvin Walker, a 19-year-old black teen, was allegedly shot and killed by an NYPD officer. Walker was armed with nothing but a cell phone.
I am so sorry about all of this. If I could go back and fix it, I would.
See You Yesterday from 2019, directed by Stefan Bristol. Now, this was the first time I'd ever watched this film. I'd heard sort of bits and pieces about it, and I really wanted to do this one on the podcast because, firstly, we haven't really done any sort of like science fiction films which have an all-black cast and deal with this kind of like subject matter. And I think this is very timely for what's going on in the world right now. And I think it's a very sort of important film. And I'm excited to talk about it with you and see what you make of it. So first off, did you know anything about this film first off going in?
Literally nothing. I think I knew the basic plot because obviously we sort these films out in advance and we know roughly what they're about so that we can schedule them. But beyond that, nothing at all.
Yeah, it's such an interesting film. So this was Stefan Bristol's first film, and he directed and co-wrote it. Spike Lee is the producer on it, and I know when it first came out, a lot of people sort of reached for Spike Lee's name and were sort of like Spike Lee's new film, but Stefan Bristol has done a really good job with this. And for this to be his first film, it's a pretty good achievement. It's on Netflix. It's like earned lots of money, I'm sure. And it's really sort of like powerful. So what did you think about like the film?
Well, I agree that it's really powerful. I wasn't in the least bit surprised to see Spike Lee's name at the end of the film, but I didn't know he was involved. And yeah, I mean, you know, I can see why people would reach for that a little bit and see it as a Spike Lee film, but this is an issue, or rather issues are dealt with in this film that it's very obvious that Spike Lee would be interested in and would want to take a producer role on it without needing to be in control of it. And I don't know what his level of input into it was, but he's like the second name as the credits roll as producer, I think. So I would assume he was arm around the shoulder to the younger Stefan Bristol. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I was really surprised by it. It really took me by surprise. I have to say, when it started, I was cringing a little bit, and I thought it was going to be pretty bad because it has a bit of a cheesy opening. You've got some super genius scientist kids wearing steampunk goggles, testing time travel backpacks in an alleyway, and I really was a bit like, oh my God, what the fuck is this film? But it goes on to treat its subject matter incredibly seriously, using time travel to explore that. And I was really, really surprised by it, and I really loved it.
Yeah, I was a little bit of two minds as well when I first sort of went in, because I was sort of like, I wasn't sure what the audience was for it, because I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be like a kid's film or if it was sort of like for an older audience. And I think it kind of toes the line between both, doesn't it?
I think so. There's a sense of humour to it that feels natural and organic throughout. Although the humour drops off as the plot gets more serious, but the relationships between the characters always feel really organic and sweet and natural. So that worked really well throughout, even though it had to get more serious.
Yeah, and I think the relationships of the characters and sort of like what they are like on screen is really important. So first off, one of the things I found out doing a bit of research on this, so CJ and Sebastian, who are the two main characters in the film, played by Eden Duncan Smith and Dante Critchlow, they're actually real-life childhood friends. So they've known each other from like years and years and years ago. I think Eden says in an interview that Dante was the first person she met after her mother or something like that.
Oh, wow.
So like, yeah, they're like really, really like old friends. And also interestingly enough, Eden is a physics major as well. So she's got that kind of like science background. She's studying that in college. So I found that interesting because all of that kind of comes across on screen. I wouldn't have like known it sort of going in. I wouldn't have presumed that because you can get all that from acting. But I think it adds that sort of extra layer to it because both of these kids are friends in real life. So they're bringing all of that sort of wealth of experience and relationship with each other on screen. And also Eden's sort of interest in science anyway is good for her character because she's portraying a young black woman who has all of this sort of like scientific knowledge. It was nice to see that and to know that the actual actress herself has that sort of background.
Yeah, that's great. And their chemistry is just lovely and it really carries the film. And yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know anything. Like I said, I didn't know anything about it, so I didn't know they were friends in real life. But they're so lovely together. It was like watching the friendship equivalent of when married couples star on screen together, and they've got that like great chemistry on screen, which doesn't always happen with married couples on screen together, but sometimes it does. They brought that onto the screen, and yeah, it was lovely. They have terrific chemistry, and it totally makes sense. So they're great friends in real life.
So they're great friends in real life, they're great friends in the film, and as friends, they come up with this ingenious invention, time relocation. So they basically invent time travel, don't they?
Yeah.
How does that sort of happen? How does it sort of work?
They're developing it for like a school science fair, I think. Is that what they're doing? They both want to get, or CJ wants to get into MIT, and I think Sebastian wants to get into some other high-profile school that I didn't recognize the name of. And to help them with that, there's a big high-profile Bronx Science High School science fair that they're planning to unveil their project at. That was when it felt a bit cheesy at the start, right? Because they're like 16, 17, I think, and they've cracked time travel and they're going to unveil it at a science fair. That just all felt a bit silly, and I thought it was going to be more of a comedy at that point because of that premise. But they're testing it in an alleyway before and after the science fair, I think. So I think they kind of missed the science fair, and that gets left to one side plot-wise as they get into the actual testing of the backpacks. What did you think of the look of it all, the design of the backpacks, and how time travel itself looks in this film?
I thought it was okay. It wasn't as sort of like crazy futuristic as I would have liked, but that's just the sort of sci-fi nerd in me, always wanting it to be like shiny and whiz bangs all over the place. But it's practical, isn't it? It's on a backpack. They've got like little goggles to try and help them when they travel through time. I don't know how that works, but it's sort of like a very particular look, isn't it? It's subtle enough that they can go about their normal lives and still have all this time travel gear on, because like there's one bit where it's like a strap and it's just like an iPhone or something with a timer. So they can just get away with it. But so I think that's probably its main strength, isn't it?
Yeah. But then you unzip the innocuous backpacks they've got on, and it's like a Ghostbuster proton pack, isn't it? But the time travel equivalent, because it's got a clock on it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And there's lots of like sort of things like that which kind of hark back to those kind of films. I mean, the obvious one is Michael J. Fox making his little cameo. That's probably when you thought it's going to be a cheesy comedy film. Am I right?
Yeah, again, as much as it just delights me to see Michael J. Fox on screen as an older man, he's just there for a joke, and he doesn't contribute anything to the plot, except to he does challenge CJ with the question, what would you go back and change, and suggest that there's complex ethical complications of time travel. He's the character that seeds that thought in the audience's mind and in CJ's mind. So he's serving a purpose there, but then he says, "Great Scott," and that made me go, "Oh God, what film is this?" Yeah. But then he's just not in the rest of the film, is he?
Yeah, he's just got that small cameo, and I think he did it because like he was so impressed with the script. He was just like, right, I'll do it.
Sure,
like,
fair enough.
I'm in. And also there's like a little Easter egg as well. So the book that he's reading is a book called Kindred, and it's by an author called Octavia E. Butler. And it's all about sort of like time travel, and it's the narrative sort of like revolves around slavery. So Octavia E. Butler is a black writer, and in that book, it's centered around a woman writer called Dana, who finds herself, I'm reading off the description here, finds herself being shunted in time between her Los Angeles, California home in 1976 and a pre-Civil War Maryland plantation. She's
experiencing a time slip then, like we've talked about in past episodes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's like another great thing about the film. It's kind of like pointing you to other literature, which sort of like is science fiction, and it's also got this other weight of themes going on in it, because that sounds like a book I would want to read as well. Like the subject matter in that sounds great, because for time travel as well, I think the difference for black communities going back in time must be a whole different thing to sort of like what we see in all these films with white casts. Like, can you imagine being black and going back to the plantations? It's like a whole different change.
There's a large shared experience that people would wish to go back and make a change to. Maybe that's a concept that we talked about in all time travel films. Is like Michael J. Fox says to CJ, what would you go back and change if you could? It's very short term in See You Yesterday. They've only got a limited short space they can travel back through. But culturally, for those communities, there is a shared wound in the past that maybe you would want to go back and change. And we talked about it like when we looked at source code, we were talking about societies wanting to use time travel to go back and change something at a grander scale. And that was a kind of post 9/11 American desire to stop terrorist attacks using time travel. So this idea that communities might share something in their past that they want to go back and make not happen is present in other time travel films. But yeah, we haven't looked at it from a black perspective before.
Yeah, and it's so important, that black perspective in this film, because the stakes are kind of a lot more, they're higher than what we've seen in some of the other films in a lot of respects, because bearing in mind, this is just two school kids having fun with time travel. That's sort of like the premise for it, but it comes with a lot of extra weight to it.
Yeah, it mixes in with their experience of the world, and it becomes a story about that with time travel layered over the top of it as a lens to look at those issues. But let's talk about them being kids traveling through time, as you just mentioned, because that's kind of what their first successful experiment is all about. It's experiment 104, I think, isn't it? They've tried a lot, but it finally works. They pop through time. The effects aren't very good. It looks a little bit like when the Flash runs through time in the TV series of the Flash. But they're successful, and they've got this now 1 day loop that they can experience. What do they get up to when they're back there?
So the first thing they do is try and, well, they're supposed to not do anything for the first time, but CJ wants to go and get her own back on her ex-boyfriend, Jared. So she goes into the corner shop or the bodega where they were at that time and chucks a slushie in Jared's face. And then that kind of throws the timeline all off, doesn't it?
I thought it was quite interesting watching this after seeing Primer, because you kind of have a similar duality in the two main characters. One of them, Abe in Primer and Bash in See You Yesterday, is much more cautious, and they've, as a pair in both films, they've committed to don't do anything, keep yourself out of the loop when you're involved in a time loop, just play it safe. And then you've got the more impulsive character, Aaron in Primer, and it's CJ in See You Yesterday. And CJ just straight away just wants to throw a slushie at her ex-boyfriend just to piss him off because he's a jerk. How did you feel about that? Because I was actually really frustrated with her when that scene happened.
Yeah, it did sort of just come a bit left field, but then they do sort of make a point about saying that she needs to control her temper, and she can sort of fly off the handle a little bit.
Yeah, she needs to control her temper, and it's a good way of establishing her as the impulsive one that's going to drive more of the time travel action of the film. So I totally understood it, but just in that moment, we've seen so many time travel films, and you know how it can go wrong. And they just agreed that they weren't going to do anything, and they were going to be really super safe. And then she does that. I was like, what are you doing? But it's essential for driving the action. Things kind of have to go wrong in time travel movies sometimes to drive the narrative.
And it's quite important how much time they have when they do travel back in time as well, because they've only got a 10-minute window. Is that right?
Yeah. How's that established? Because I thought they were going to have more time than that, and then they arrive and the backpacks just aren't good enough, and it's actually saying you've got to get back in 10 minutes or something.
Yeah, it's something to do with the battery life or something. I don't know. They work out that they only have 10 minutes, so they have to run back to the alleyway to make sure they're at the right place so they can go back to where they were.
Yeah, why do they have to keep going back to the alleyway? Was that just because it was an inconspicuous place, or was there some sort of requirement that they had to be arriving and leaving at the same point?
I think it's just because it's inconspicuous, because CJ does go into the garage at one point to travel.
That's right.
Through time. Yeah, but yeah, that's sort of like the least conspicuous place.
But you're missing the big picture here. If time travel were possible, it would be the greatest ethical and philosophical conundrum of the modern age. If you had that kind of power, what would you do? What would you change?
So that's the first time they travel back in time. So they've tested it, they know it works, and then they sort of just go on with their lives and think they're going to just have this sort of like science fair, and that's all they're going to use the time travel for. So CJ, we already know, is quite impulsive, and we already know about her relationship with her brother as well. So her brother is the sort of like other big character in this film. So her brother Calvin, what happens is there's a robbery happening at the same bodega they visited in their first travel through time. And Calvin is walking with his friends. These guys run past him, and the police think that Calvin and his friend are the people which have just robbed this corner shop. When that happens, Calvin is reaching for his ID or something like that, is what we sort of learn, and then is shot. That's the real turning point in the film, isn't it? Because CJ has this amazing time travel invention, and she's just lost her brother in this truly horrific way.
And we know she's super impulsive as well. So we kind of know what's going to happen next. And that's exactly what happened. She wants to go back and fix it. But but they have to weave in a bit more science explaining things, don't they? Because they've only got that 1 day jump, the way they've set it up. So they have to change the backpacks a little bit to make them more powerful.
Yeah, and also there's the sort of the double problem, which we always worry about with time travel films. It's like, if you keep going back, then you're just going to create more doubles of yourself. And they kind of erase that in this, don't they? Because they reckon if they power the backpacks up enough, they can reset their time travel. So they go back and it's kind of like a respawn point.
Yeah, it's a bit ropey, this one, isn't it? They explain it through dialogue completely sufficiently for the film to work, but they also seem to try and explain it with some science and as always happens in these films, I never know if is the science stupid or am I stupid? Like, is it really well explained and it makes total sense and I just don't get it? Or when they come out with all that techno babble to say why it's now powerful or depowered enough that it'll reset the loop, does that just not make sense? I don't know.
I just like the fact they kind of simplified it and were like, right, we're just gonna we do this thing and then we go back and it's fine, and we don't have to worry about bumping into this person and this person who is also us, and yeah, so we can just have a clean slate of it. So I quite like that as an idea, just to sort of simplify it down a little bit, even though it's maybe not explained as sort of like as detailed or as well as it might have been.
Yeah, but having seen so many other time travel movies, it was useful to have that set out early, that this isn't going to be Primer. This isn't going to be a film where there's multiple duplicates and we have to have an increasingly complex universe where lots of people are looping around at the same time and all trying to avoid each other. I guess that dialogue is there, whether it makes sense or not. It's just there to kind of set out to sci-fi fans. That's not what's happening in this film. Every time we go back, it's a nice clean slate and we're going to try again.
Yeah. So the only people you've got to worry about when you go back is your original selves in that timeline. You haven't got to worry about any duplicates which might have happened when you traveled last time.
At that point in the film, it kind of felt like we've got infinite lives in the video game to fix the problem. But that's not the case throughout the rest of the film, because things get increasingly worse and the characters really struggle to fix things.
Guys, you got a control problem, CJ, and you need to deal with that shit.
You need to deal with your control problem. You're always trying to freaking control me.
Not the same age.
Oh my gosh,
this is
you're
crazy,
3 years
CJ.
older than me.
Hey,
All right, relax.
Hey!
We're good?
Yeah.
You're a little loud over here.
Everything's fine, officer.
Yo, fair warning, I'm recording. I'll send this shit viral.
All right, nothing's wrong, officer. Just talking
I'm
to
not
my brother.
asking you. I'm asking him.
They come across a lot of obstacles in trying to save Calvin. So first off, they try to just reach him before the police do, but they find out with this time limit, they can't get there in time. There's no way they can do that. So instead, they try and stop the robbery from happening. But then when that happens, that causes another set of problems, doesn't it?
Yeah, they end up placing themselves at the robbery. And I mean, we get an even sadder, more horrible scene. It's obviously dealing with really serious stuff with Calvin dying and CJ mourning that loss. And then they ramp things up because they place themselves at the scene of the robbery trying to stop it. And Bash from the past shows up, ends up getting killed in that original timeline, which then causes time traveling Bash to vanish with Back to the Future rules, I guess. He just sort of, but it's even more horrible than it's done in Back to the Future because he experiences the gunshot wound in real time, chokes up blood, and then vanishes. They could have just done the vanish like they would do in like Back to the Future or something like that, but this film is about violence and it's about that kind of thing, so it has to be a lot more frightening and upsetting on screen. So we have Bash like puking up that blood before he does that.
Yeah, because it's a real thing that happens. It's like it happens like more times than it ever should in America.
Yeah. And
they have to sort of make that punchy there to give it that extra impact. And the only other death that we've sort of heard about, we haven't seen Calvin be shot by the police. We haven't seen any of that. So this is like the first death we're properly experiencing as an audience. So it needs to be powerful. And yeah, it happens. And then CJ goes back to her present, back to the future. And then she's having to sort of deal with all of this upset again. So like she saved Calvin, but in doing so, Sebastian's dead.
Yeah.
So she has to go to another funeral for another like friend. And yeah, it's really powerful.
Yeah, and it says a lot about the kind of ripple effect of the violence that a community like that would experience when a violent event happens. And it's not just one thing that's a closed book. It's affecting all these other people in all these different ways. And I think the film's trying to use the time travel and the looping to show how it can affect different people in so many different ways. And that, like I said, there's no easy wins, and there's no easy fix. And if you look for the easy fix, then other bad things kind of come about from that. And it's kind of an inescapable amount of violence happening.
And I think the other thing we should also talk about is the fact that, so it's got all of these terrible things happening to these characters, but the film has built up these characters' lives beforehand. We've seen them in their communities. We've seen them, like CJ and Sebastian, they fix people's laptops and they've got that little business that they're running. There's Sebastian's granddad who's got the garage where they work out of. They've got the big barbecue that happens. It's a real sense of community, and you see all of these people just living their lives happily, and there's no sort of worry there, but there's all this other stuff that could happen at any time just in the back of their minds, and then it does of course happen in the film. And because we've had all that sort of like, we've seen how they live and how like good they are as people, to see this extra stuff just adds that extra weight to it.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of horrible after effects. Like after Bash dies, his grandmother has just like a complete nervous breakdown, and she kind of, I think she just gets carted off to hospital, and her grandpa's there just dealing with it. And CJ's sort of witnessing this, and she's got all the knowledge of time travel, and she's, I think, blaming herself a little bit there because she's the one that, you know, she was pushing to go back and change things, and it's led to this horrible result for Sebastian.
So at that point, we've seen Calvin die. We've been to his funeral. We've seen Sebastian die. We've been to his funeral as well. And the funerals become a significant plot point as well, in that because CJ was at Calvin's funeral previously, she had a copy of the funeral program, and then Calvin finds that and is really confused. He thinks it's some sort of weird joke. But then you find out that he finds out the revelation about the time travel, and that sort of like leads us into that third act, doesn't it? Because Calvin is helping CJ try to fix the problem that she's created.
Yeah, now Calvin's teaming up with CJ, and it's an interesting mirroring to Frequency a little bit in the way that it starts. It starts off as saving one person, and then there's change in the film and it becomes about saving another one of the characters. So it's kind of got that similarity there. And yeah, the funeral stuff becomes really important. Like you said, that funeral program that Calvin finds is a really important tool in the kind of climax of the film, and it's following Back to the Future rules. And I'd say most of the film slots in with Back to the Future rules, right? You've got characters disappearing because they die, and you've also got this artifact of a possible future that changes and shifts depending on which character. But it's just horrible, isn't it? Like, so Marty McFly carries a photo of his family, and his brother and sister disappear from it if he's not succeeding at his time travel mission. And that's horrible because his family's disappearing from reality. In this film, we've got a funeral program, but it just alternates between Calvin or Sebastian. So there is no good outcome for that thing. It's obeying Back to the Future rules because it shifts depending on how the mission is going, but there's nothing good can come of it. One of those characters seems to have to die. But the changing of that artifact is the thing that ultimately convinces Calvin of what's going on. And this was a bit confusing towards the end of the film. They finally catch up to Calvin. They're trying to convince him. And he's been having this weird sensation of there's something wrong about the day that he didn't have on any of the other timelines. What did you make of that?
So this is the sort of like, it's the quite sad thing as well, because Calvin is kind of like, he doesn't see his life as being worth as much as Sebastian and CJ's. And he kind of like carries that with him because he says like, oh, I'm not going to achieve anything. You're the one who's going to do something with your life, to CJ earlier in the film. So it's kind of like he's carrying all that weight, but he's trying to be a good older brother to his sister. And before CJ goes back in time to try and save Sebastian again, Calvin says, if you can't convince me, then just make sure you're okay, or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording, but it feels like along those lines. He's kind of saying like, do your best, but then make sure you're okay. Because it's a dangerous situation that she's throwing herself into because she knows the outcome.
Yeah, and that's very heartbreaking because, yeah, Calvin's a really interesting character. Like, he obviously sees the potential in CJ and Sebastian. They're like, you know, child prodigy geniuses. They're going to go on to have like an amazing university career and whatever else after that. And he sees it better that he would die than Sebastian, like you said. But he's no dummy. Like, he adapts very quickly to the situation to help CJ in the future timeline, and he responds really quickly in the moment, and he seems to kind of catch on to the time travel in one of the final loops that we see when he sees the funeral program turn to Sebastian. He seems to, I think he's understanding a little bit of the implications of what that means, to the extent that he stands up and gets himself shot because he thinks that's going to at least mean that Sebastian's not the one that gets shot and features on the funeral program. And he's right, and that is how they save him.
Because that's the really poignant bit of the film, that last scene where you finally see the moment where Calvin is confronted by the police and you see what happens afterwards. And there is that moment when you think maybe they'll all get out of this, and you're kind of willing that to happen. But knowing the situation, knowing the kind of message that this film is trying to sort of like provide for people and to give them that knowledge of sort of what can happen in America and what has happened, that moment where you see Sebastian being thrown on the ground and then you can see the police officer with his knee on his neck, and you know like what will happen if he stays in that position. That, yeah, like you said, that bit, because Calvin is aware of that. He knows these things happen. He knows that is what's going to happen if he doesn't do anything. And the only thing he can do is stand up, and then by standing up, the police officer shoots him.
I kind of thought as well, when they were all four of them together in that loop, like this had to be it. This had to be the success. She had all these extra things, like the funeral program was going to convince him, and they've got this thing about the dog tags that belong to their father that only he's allowed to carry, but she's got them as well. So it's like, you know, I've brought with me all of this proof. I've got to be able to convince him, but it's just not enough. It's like this fixed event or a fixed amount of tragedy that has to happen to one of these characters, and it just can't seem to be resolved. And that leads us into the ending, because I was quite surprised by the ending. So let's talk about that. What did you make of that? Because she goes back one final time to the future, and still, you know, she's brought Sebastian back, but she still just can't save everyone. She can't save Calvin, and I was really surprised by the ending. So what did you make of it?
I really liked the ending, actually, because I kind of like, because of given the subject matter and what they're talking about and the importance of the message, I feel like they couldn't wrap everything up in a nice bow. They couldn't give it that traditional ending. And this is something Stefan Bristol said in interviews as well. So the line that he said in one interview, which I caught online, is he said, if he'd given the film a traditional ending, it would be an offensive oversimplification of why this movie has been made, of a tragedy that is still happening today. I refuse to simplify it. So if they'd all survived at the end of this, if CJ had fixed everything, then it would kind of be saying like, well, we can just fix stuff. It's fine. You don't really have to put in much effort. You just need a time machine. But these things are happening still, and there hasn't been a solution yet. People aren't trying hard enough. And at the end of it, you've got CJ running towards the audience, and she's sort of like looking to help. She's looking to sort of save her brother, her friend, and she kind of like, she needs help. Like, she can't just do it on her own, but she's trying to. And it's kind of like, it's just, I found it very powerful, that like last scene and that last moment where she's just running at you.
Yeah, I didn't read into that idea of running towards us, the viewers. I liked it because, and the reason it took me by surprise was, well, it's just quite abrupt. It happens very suddenly. But I did like that there was that kind of perfect level of ambiguity. I do think that you could see that film and think that she's going to succeed, because the way it's presented, like the music, there's some very, very sad music in the scene before, as she's unable to save her brother, and then there's this like really uplifting, pumping, surging music as she's running, and it feels like the build up to the heroic, victorious moment, but then it just cuts and the film ends very suddenly.
Yeah.
So I think I can see that someone might look at that and take that music and that tone to be like, oh, something good's about to happen. But I was more feeling like we've just seen like failure after failure to sort things out in the way that the characters want. And it actually just felt like a really sad ending, because I thought, oh no, this character CJ, with all her amazing talent and all her knowledge and all this life that she's got ahead of her, it looks to me like she is forever stuck in a voluntary time loop. She is going to keep going back as many times as it takes. And all the evidence we've seen so far suggests that she's not going to be able to save both of her brothers, her real brother and her like surrogate brother, best friend. It's just going to go wrong every time.
I think that's it, isn't it? Because something needs to change in order for that to happen. And until that change happens, she's not going to succeed. But I mean, like you said, you can read it in any way you want. It depends on how you perceive the situation. Like, it is like you said, it's got that triumphant music, like she's going to save the day. And there's no reason why she can't in the sort of like structure of the film, but it needs that change. It needs something else to happen in order to allow her to do it.
So throughout the film, CJ just has no luck getting things off the ground. She's tried to go back to save her brother, and things just get more and more complicated and worse and worse. We're going to be taking that theme forward into our next episode. We're going to be looking at two films where time travel gets out of control, and trying to change things in your past just start to unravel the world around you. So what are the films we're going to be looking at next week to explore that, James?
So the first film we're going to be looking at next week is The Butterfly Effect from 2004, starring Ashton Kutcher. Remember that one from my teens, definitely. And the anime feature film The Girl Who Leapt Through Time from 2006.
I'm so apprehensive about watching The Butterfly Effect because I love it and I haven't watched it since it came out, and the Rotten Tomatoes scores for it make me very nervous about seeing it. But I'm really looking forward to seeing The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. I've been meaning to watch that for ages, so that's going to be great.
Yeah, should be a good one. So make sure you are subscribed to the podcast. You can find us online. You can come and chat to us. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. If you look up @Through Sci-Fi or @Through Sci-Fi Pod, you'll be able to find us, or just search Journey Through Sci-Fi on Google. We'll pop up, I'm sure.
Please also leave us a review. That's really helpful. Anything you can do in that regard would be most appreciated. In the meantime, take care, and we will see you next week.